Welcome everyone to the Answers on Video series. I'm Axel Threlfall. Today we're looking at tax reform. As recently as last month, the Chancellor was quoted in the French press as saying he did not foresee regulatory or fiscal reform as a result of Brexit. However, there are some in the Cabinet who differ dramatically on this issue. I'm here in London with Dan Neidle, a specialist in tax at international law firm Clifford, and Laurence Kiddle, Managing Director of the tax and accounting business at Thomson Reuters. To provide us with a little bit of context for our conversation today, I'd like us to see part of a debate I moderated recently on tax havens. One of the panellists was the distinguished tax lawyer David Goldberg QC, who's a forthright advocate for reform of the tax code.
This country is burdened by an unbalanced tax system. We should be, I am, ashamed of it. We need to apologise for the poverty of our example. Washing the flag in attempted expiation is more appropriate than flying it. I think everyone here who has ever filled in or tried to fill in their own tax return will know the twin feelings of oppression and depression which overwhelm you when you start the task. It doesn't have to be like that. A simpler, clearer tax system, the type of tax code that is found in so-called tax havens, does not impose feelings of that kind. But it still does the job.
So a typically forthright statement there from David Goldberg, but he proposes in this clip and throughout the debate, in fact, that the length and relative complication of the tax code has serious consequences for the UK economy and for the national well-being. PwC produced some interesting research in their Paying Taxes survey measuring time to comply, evaluating the ease of paying taxes for a typical medium-sized company. Just to run you through the results quickly, UK was 110 hours. By comparison, EU average 164, France 139 and Germany 218. Hong Kong was 74, but they do have that huge advantage of not having VAT. Let's get to our guest. Laurence, how legitimate do you think is David's claim that our tax code is a source of national embarrassment?
Well, forthright, I think, was a really good word to describe it. I'll make a couple of points on this one, perhaps, if I may. It's undeniable that the UK tax code is complex. You know, it's over 10 million words now. It's growing. It's going to continue to grow. You know, George Osborne promised when he became Chancellor in 2009, on a simplification basis, you know, it actually grew 21% over the next Parliament. I think there's been an oxymoron in this one, perhaps. It's simplification often requires transitional rules to get from a very complex state, perhaps, to a more simple state. Now, that process of transition is in itself incredibly complex. So perhaps you get more difficult before you can get simpler. That might be one perspective.
All right. Dan, you advise international clients on the relative complexity of tax codes. Do you think ours is particularly onerous here in the UK?
I think if you ask any UK tax advisor, they'll say it's the most complex in the world. Right. If you ask any German tax advisor, they'll say theirs is the most complex in the world, and the Americans will at that point be deeply offended and say, no, theirs is bigger, worse, more complicated.
Is it perverse national pride, do you think, perhaps?
I think there is an element of perverse national pride. I mean, David Goldberg is an extremely distinguished tax advisor, but I disagree with almost everything he said then.
What about the Office of Tax Simplification? Is that having any impact yet? Do you expect it to have any impact anytime soon?
Sure, at the margin. So, for example, there are special rules for veterans of the Crimean War, which took up space in the tax code and no longer will. Great, fantastic. They can do something there. But most of what people, individuals, companies perceive as tax complication is not about that. It's about all the layers of complexity and special rules and anti-avoidance rules that have come in over the years. Not just here, but everywhere. It's a natural consequence of having a very complex economy with people doing all kinds of different things and naughty people trying to do things deliberately to get better tax results. Right, yeah. And it takes you a one-way trip to complexity.
We'll come on to those naughty people, as you call them. But back to the international parallels, though. I mean, do you think there are any where you could call out where a simpler system makes it easier to gather taxes? What would you point to?
Sure. So, personal experience of this. My wife is unlucky enough to be American and unlucky enough to have spent time working in France. So for one glorious year, we had to complete a tax return for her for the UK, France and the US. And easily the simplest was the UK tax return.
Is that right?
And that's because HMRC have built a rather splendid online system. And for most people who don't have very complex personal tax affairs, It's straightforward. In America, an ordinary middle-class person will spend a long time, many hours, maybe many days, and almost always have to pay some outside helper to help them complete their tax return.
Yeah. Let's bring Brexit into this conversation. Of course, we've got to bring Brexit in, of course. No one really knows what final impact this is going to have on our domestic tax system. Laurence, do you think there's an opportunity here for British legislators to change things, to make it even simpler, to make it even quicker as a result of what we're doing?
Yeah, without doubt, some things have to change as a result of Britain exiting the European Union. So, for example, VAT has to change. It's based on European directives. There's some very specific rules that govern the supply of goods and services within the EU. And while the actual tax treatment doesn't change, because no tax really changes hands here, the way we describe those treatments has to change. So the legislators have to get involved in that case. While the actual tax treatment doesn't change, this creates complexity for business, unfortunately, because systems have to change. And a simple case of changing a VAT code and accounting system could take many hours, cost many thousands of pounds. That's just the way that companies work, unfortunately. There could be some really popular wins, though, I think. If you look at the politics of this one, for example, VAT on fuel, on energy taxes, VAT on energy, is a European regulation. We pay 5% reduced charge on that. It'd be massively political popular to take that away. I think the question is priority. Does anyone want to do this now?
Dan, what do you, when your clients ask you about Brexit and the impact, what are you telling them now?
I'm not sure Brexit will have much impact on tax. I mean, VAT, yes, there'll be changes that are necessary. There'll be some changes of choice. And no doubt, over the next 10, 20 years, the VAT systems in the UK and on the continent will diverge just through the random collection of policy choices, accidents, happenstance. We may end up with very different systems, but that'll be over time. So I'm not expecting much.
Is there an appetite in Parliament, though, for change, for wholesale change?
Well, that's this idea that the UK could respond to Brexit by becoming a Singapore off the coast of France. As far as I can see, it's total fantasy. Where if you wanted to and could shrink the size of the British state, abolish the NHS, privatise this, privatise that, then maybe you could turn the UK into the Singapore of Europe. But back in the real world, not going to happen.
I'll say also, perhaps tax policy isn't the way you dictate that anyway. If you look at, for example, something like R&D tax credits, which are intended to increase R&D spend, there's some interesting work on this by the Office of National Statistics, that the amount paid out in R&D tax credits has gone up 100 million to £1 billion over a 10-year period. The amount companies spent on R&D in that time didn't change. So the tax code system was perhaps not encouraging behaviour they thought it could do. So to make tax policy the Singapore off the coast of France doesn't really stack up. There's much more needs to happen for that.
All right, let's get back to David Goldberg. He touched also upon an issue, namely the finance bill, which is politically controversial. This is what he had to say.
The last finance bill, though not yet enacted, contained a proposal that in certain circumstances, lawyers should be subjected to a penalty for doing their job and advising people as to the law. That is a proposal so venal and contrary to the rule of law that it should, in this country, be unimaginable. But it has been imagined.
Forthright again. So David's raising the government proposal that lawyers and accountants who create tax avoidance schemes could be fined up to 100% of amount avoided. A logical conclusion, I guess, of political action as a result of public anger at companies and celebrities seemingly avoiding tax. Dan, this argument that essentially, I guess, that lawyers and tax advisors could be heavily penalised, how real is that? How scared do they need to be?
Well, the first iteration of these rules was pretty scary. You could have fines up to 100% of the tax avoided, and it could apply for anything that the revenue thought was an avoidance scheme, and they were able to successfully attack as such. And many advisors were concerned that they could be advising on something that to them was an innocent transaction, but unbeknownst to them was some avoidance scheme, and they could be hit by this. And to their credit, I think the government recognised that. We now have penalties limited to 100% of the fees the advisor charged, but critically, it doesn't apply to avoidance, it applies to abuse. So only if you have something which is so unreasonable that no reasonable person would say it's a sensible course of action, only then is it within these rules. So for the great majority of advisors, I expect everybody watching this, these rules are not going to be relevant. The people they will be relevant to are some of the boutiques who build things which frankly never work, shouldn't exist, and then flog them to unsuspecting clients.
Where is the, and again, what are you telling your clients on the distinction between advising clients on the law and observing the letter of the law?
Well, I think that ship has sailed a long time ago. These days, clients don't want to know from me, does this work technically? Well, yes, they do, but they also want to know, how's this going to be perceived? If this ends up on the front page of the FT, are people going to think, wow, they were really sailing close to the line there, they shouldn't have done this, it's unethical, or are they going to shrug their shoulders and move on? People are keenly interested in how anything tax-related will be perceived, and that's going to continue for a while.
But is there concern? Is there worry?
For sure.
Is it lessening now, that concern, would you say?
No, not remotely. If you're doing anything remotely complicated, and we're in Canary Wharf, all the buildings around us, anything these banks do is going to be complicated, that could be viewed by an unsympathetic journalist as being tax avoidance. You look at elements out of context, misunderstand other elements. So it's a very difficult path for anyone seeking to build a tax strategy and build transactions. They're going to survive that kind of scrutiny.
I think we're also now seeing that changing actual business behaviour retrospectively perhaps as well. And you look at a couple of fairly high profile recent examples. So for example, McDonald's shift their European base from Luxembourg to the UK. They had a lower rate of tax in Luxembourg, now that's undeniable. But the perception of it was they didn't have substance there. And that substance, I think, really forced them to think, well, how does this look?
Yeah.
What are the optics, if you like?
Yeah.
And the optics say, you're not a Luxembourg business. So they forego the tax advantage to do that.
Let's finish up on this, because we've got one more clip from, I guess, the feisty David Goldberg. In this debate, David made it clear that multinationals, so the example he used was Google, had observed the letter of the law and paid the amount that was owed to HMRC. This is what he had to say.
I don't think anybody who really understands what was going on thinks Google was avoiding tax, was paying tax in accordance with the law in this country, just as it should have done. And let me say that the amount of tax on which they paid, the amount of profit on which they paid tax was commercially the right amount. What is going on at the moment is a pretense that companies are earning more within the jurisdiction that is seeking to tax than they actually are. It's deception on the public. The idea that Google was avoiding tax is fantasy land.
So is David showing a tin ear here to public opinion for consumer-facing companies in particular? Dan, let me put that to you. Do you think he is?
Well, put it this way. Whenever you have a story these days about a company accused of avoiding tax, if that story ends with a quote from the company's PR people saying X and Y company has complied with the letter of the law in all the territories in which it operates, does that end the story? No, people laugh. It's not a defence which flies anymore.
Are we moving on to new territory where it's no longer acceptable for companies to just obey the law, but really need to be seen to acting for the public good?
That may be putting it too strong, but if you're acting in a way which you think just about complies with the letter of the law, you are asking for trouble. You're asking for a degree of public scrutiny you probably don't want. You're asking for changes of law targeting you. You're asking for tax authorities to challenge you. Most companies don't want that to be their existence. They are not set up to spend their time fighting tax disputes. They want to actually do business.
Is there evidence, either of you, that the companies are indeed, in fact, taking less efficient routes?
I think there is. There's a fairly recent survey within the Financial Times that covered this, actually. It looked at filings of US companies to the SEC. Now, there's a dramatic rise, I think over 100% rise in the number of companies who are flagging tax risk in their accounts. Not to the point they're saying we're going to pay more tax in the future. That's kind of a given looking at some of the structure. But actually they're going to pay more tax retrospectively as well. So they're going to go back, look at the accounts, look at the structure and say, actually, perhaps we could take a slightly different view of this one. So it's already changed commercial behaviour. And I think you'll see these companies seeing that effectively as the price of doing business now. The efficient tax structure was the past, now it's the call of public opinion. And that's rather stricter, I think, than the authorities.
You agree with that?
Yeah, I completely agree
What
with
is
that.
driving this globally?
What's driving it? Well, it's a confluence of events. One is the financial crisis and the lack of sympathy that engendered in the public and media towards large business. Partly it's the stream of revelations about structures by people like Google, like Apple, like Starbucks. Then it's the actions taken against that. You had the G20 and the OECD coming out with the BEPS proposals which reshape the rules of international tax. All of that happening at once, and something's got to give. And what's giving are really the norms on which companies have built a lot of their behaviour over the last 30 years.
And I'll throw one more thing into that as well. I agree with all of those points, absolutely. The final point you make on that one actually is that governments can do this now. Right, there's been a huge technology shift over the last 3 to 4 years, particularly around tax, particularly how they gather tax information. So it's not just a return, there's a whole bunch of supporting documentation. There's the ability to take that electronically and the ability for the OECD largely to look at that cross-border. So governments are now armed. They're kind of ahead in this arms race because they have much more data on tax than they ever used to before. And companies don't have that.
Yeah.
I'm going to be boring and agree strongly with Laurence there. So BEPS, 15 sets of proposals, many of which are mind-numbingly technically complex. The one that will have the biggest impact of all is country-by-country reporting,
Absolutely.
as Laurence just described. So tax authorities, instead of seeing this small part of the world that happens to touch their country, will suddenly see the global picture. And if you're in Italy, say, you'll suddenly become aware that there's this company in Luxembourg making a lot more profit on which it pays tax than the Italian subsidiary does. And you may well think, I'll have a piece of that, please. And the behaviour that will drive on the part of tax authorities may create a whole new level beyond what we've been seeing in the past few years.
All right, I've got to stop it there. Dan, Laurence, thank you very much indeed to both of you. Dan Neidle from Clifford Chance, Laurence Kiddle from Thomson Reuters. That's it for this edition of Answers On. For other Answers On programmes, do come to this platform. Thanks for watching. I'm Axel Threlfall.